She said it like it was nothing, like she was commenting on the weather, or remarking that dinner needed more salt. We were getting ready for her firm's anniversary dinner, and I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror adjusting my tie when she said it. You know, my ex knew how to dress. He had this whole effortless thing about him. You always look like you're trying too hard. I didn't say anything. I just kept adjusting my tie. That was the night I decided. I'm 51 years old. I spent 17 years building a life I was proud of. A house in Raleigh, a consulting business that finally stopped bleeding money around year 4, and a marriage I thought was real. My wife. I'll call her by what she was to me then. My wife was a corporate attorney at a mid-sized firm downtown. Sharp. Ambitious. The kind of woman who made you feel lucky just to be noticed by her. I noticed her at a fundraiser in 2007. She laughed at something her colleagues said and the sound carried across the whole room. I walked over before I even knew I was moving. We married in 2009. Her son Eli was 7 when I met him. His biological father had been gone since he was 2. Not dead, just absent in the way that's somehow worse than dead, because he'd made a conscious choice. The boy had his mother's eyes, and his grandmother's stubbornness, and this particular way of tilting his head when he was working something out that I came to love more than I expected. I never tried to replace his father. I just showed up. Every school play, every soccer game where he stood in the field looking at the clouds instead of the ball, every homework meltdown at the kitchen table at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, I showed up. By the time he was 12, he called me Dad without being asked. That meant everything to me. Still does. I want to be clear about something before I get into the rest of this. I am not a man who looks for drama. I am not a man who holds grudges or nurses wounds or replays arguments in my head. I am by nature a person who moves forward. My mother raised me that way. She was a practical woman from outside Asheville who believed that most problems could be solved by doing the next useful thing. I tried to live by that, but there are situations where the practical thing and the right thing take a long time to find each other, and in the middle of that gap you just have to survive. Looking back, I can see the distance growing as early as 2019. She started traveling more for work. I understood that. She was being considered for partner, which was something she'd wanted since before she passed the bar. I supported it fully. I cooked more dinners, handled Eli's college applications, rearranged my own schedule around her depositions and client dinners, and late nights at the office. The problem with being a person who makes space is that sometimes other things fill it. I didn't know that yet, or maybe I did, and I wasn't ready to know it. The comment about her ex wasn't the first one. There had been others over the past year. Little comparisons dropped into conversations, like pebbles into still water. He used to take her to this restaurant in Charleston. He never forgot anniversaries. He was so present, just so emotionally available. I listened to each one and told myself she was venting, processing something old, going through a stressful period at work. I have a talent for generous interpretation. It has served me well, and betrayed me badly in equal measure. What broke through wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was a receipt. I found it in March, tucked inside the pocket of her blazer when I was taking a load to the dry cleaner. Hotel receipt. Downtown Raleigh. March 7th. One night. We had been home that night. Both of us. Together. Which meant the receipt wasn't from that night. It was from a different March 7th entirely. It was dated 2023, and I was holding it in 2024. She had kept it, for over a year, in a blazer pocket, either careless or, and this thought arrived quietly and settled in like something that had always been there. She simply stopped caring whether I found it. I put the receipt in my desk drawer. I went back to work. I didn't say anything for 3 days. I just watched. I'm not proud of the way I felt during those 3 days. There was anger, obviously, the kind that lives in your chest and makes everything too loud, but underneath it was something worse. A kind of retroactive grief, like I was mourning a version of my marriage that might have been alive for longer than I could currently calculate. I kept having the thought, how long? And then I would push it away because I wasn't ready to answer it yet. On the 4th day, I called a man I'll call my brother-in-law, because that's what he was. Her older brother, Terrence. We had been close, genuinely close, the kind of in-law relationship people call lucky. He'd come to my father's funeral. He'd called me during the worst stretch of the pandemic just to check in. I trusted him. I didn't tell him what I found. I just asked, carefully, if he'd noticed anything different about his sister lately. Long pause. He said she seems stressed. He said she'd been asking him about property law. Just hypothetically. He said he thought she and I were going through something. I thanked him and got off the phone. The word hypothetically did a lot of work in that sentence. I made an appointment with an attorney, not to file, not yet, but to understand my situation. My attorney's name is not important, but she was exactly what I needed: unsentimental, thorough, and allergic to drama. She asked me to document everything I could before we talked next: asset inventory, communications, patterns of behavior. She explained how things worked in North Carolina, which is not a no-fault state in the way people sometimes assume. I went home and I started paying attention differently. I want to be clear that I am not a person who hacked into accounts or ran surveillance. What I did was look at what was already in front of me. The credit card statements I had always had access to and never examined closely. The calendar on the shared family iPad that she had stopped updating 6 months ago. The way certain calls went to the bedroom rather than being taken in the kitchen like they used to be. It took about 3 weeks. His name came up in a chain of emails she'd left open on the family laptop. She'd forgotten I used it occasionally for video calls. I won't say his name here. He worked at her firm. Senior associate, her department. The emails were professional on their surface, but there were phrases in them that weren't professional at all. There was a specific line about a particular evening in February that I have never been able to forget and will not repeat. I took photos with my phone. I forwarded myself nothing. My attorney had advised against that. I just documented what I saw with timestamps and my own written notes, dated and detailed. I continued this for 2 more weeks. By the end, I had enough. More than enough. During all of this, I was still cooking dinners, still going to sleep beside her, still answering, "How was your day?" with a real answer. I have thought about this a lot since then, whether it was dishonest, whether I was doing something manipulative. I've landed here. I was protecting myself. I was doing what any reasonable person would do before ending the most significant relationship of their life. I needed to be certain, and I was building the ground I would eventually need to stand on. Eli came home for spring break in April. He was a junior at NC State by then. Biology, pre-med. The kid who used to watch clouds during soccer had turned into someone who stayed up until 2 in the morning reading papers on cellular regeneration. He'd grown into this serious, gentle man who still tilted his head the same way when he was thinking. He noticed something was wrong within about 12 hours. He didn't say anything directly at first. He just stayed close, which was his way. He helped me with dinner without being asked. He came and sat in my office while I was working, not doing anything, just present. On his second night home, after his mother had gone to bed early with a headache that I now understood differently than I once would have, he came and found me in the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter and said, "Something's going on." It wasn't a question. I looked at my stepson for a long moment. He was 22 years old. He was an adult, and he was someone who deserved honesty more than he deserved, a curated version of events. I said, "Yeah, there is." I didn't tell him everything. I told him enough. I told him that I had found some things that concerned me, that I was being careful and deliberate, that I was not going to do anything rash, that I didn't know yet how everything would resolve, but that I needed him to know that whatever happened, my relationship with him was not contingent on anything else, that he was my son in the way that mattered, which is the way people choose to show up. It was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've known something was off for months. She's been different." I didn't want to say anything because I didn't know if I was reading it wrong. I asked him what he meant. He said his mother had been asking him questions about his living situation, whether he'd want to stay in Raleigh after graduation, whether he'd thought about living with her if things changed. He said the questions felt like she was planning something. I nodded. He said, "Whatever you need, Dad, I'm here." I had to look away for a moment. The firm's spring gala was the 3rd week of April. She'd asked me to attend with her. It was one of those events where spouses were expected, where absence got noticed and noted. I agreed to go. I had a reason for wanting to be there. Her father was also attending. I had always been close with him. A retired high school principal from outside Charlotte. A man named Frank who believed in directness and maintained that dishonesty was a form of disrespect. We had built a genuine friendship over 15 years, the kind that wasn't dependent on the marriage to survive, though I didn't know yet whether it actually could. I spoke to Frank before the event. I called him the day before and asked if I could meet him for coffee in the morning. He said yes without asking why, which told me he already suspected something. We met at a diner near his hotel. I brought the documentation. I laid it out, plainly, without editorializing. He read through it. He was very still. He drank his coffee. He asked 2 questions. How long had I known, and had I talked to his daughter directly? I answered both honestly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I am ashamed. I want you to know that. I told him he had nothing to be ashamed of. He said, she was raised to know better. We sat there for a few minutes, just two men who had become family through circumstances that were now dissolving. He reached across the table and shook my hand. It was a strange gesture in that context. It felt like an acknowledgement, like he was saying, I see you. You are real. This was real. I appreciated it more than I can explain. The gala itself was uneventful on the surface. She was in a professional mode, charming, fluent, working the room with the ease that had always impressed me. I stayed close but didn't crowd her. I talked to people. I ate the food. I watched. He was there. I recognized him from the email account photo I had seen. He spoke to her twice during the evening, both times briefly and in full view of other people. He was careful. She was careful. She was careful. They had clearly been careful for a long time. About halfway through the evening, she found me near the bar and tilted her head toward the balcony doors. We stepped outside. It was a mild April night, the kind of night Raleigh does well, she said, in a tone I recognized from every difficult conversation we'd ever had, that she thought we needed to talk, that things had been strained, that she'd been feeling disconnected, that she wanted us to try counseling. I listened to all of it. Then I said, I found the receipt from March 7th, 2023, and I found the emails from February. She went very still. I told her I had documented everything, that I had already spoken with an attorney, and that I thought the most respectful path for both of us was to proceed honestly. I told her I wasn't angry in the way she might expect. I was past angry. I was on the other side of it. She started to say something and I held up my hand, not aggressively, just clearly. I said, I'd like to enjoy the rest of the evening. We can talk tomorrow. And I walked back inside. I will not tell you I felt triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. I felt like a man who had been carrying a weight for 6 months and had just set it down somewhere couldn't hurt me anymore. She tried to speak with me 3 more times that evening. Each time I was engaged in a conversation with someone else, genuinely, because I had decided I was going to be a person at that event rather than a problem at that event. Her father found me near the end of the night and squeezed my arm without saying anything. That was enough. We separated the following month. The divorce was not easy. It was not the ordeal it might have been without the prenuptial agreement we'd signed in 2009. But she had a very good attorney, her colleague, naturally, and the process took the better part of a year. There were moments that were genuinely painful. There were moments that felt absurd. There was a period where I had to fight to keep certain business assets clearly established as premarital, which is where the documentation my attorney had advised me to build became important in a different way than I'd originally expected. In the end, she received what the agreement specified, a percentage of marital assets accrued during the marriage. Not nothing, but also not the position she would have been in had she not behaved the way she did, which affected certain provisions within the agreement tied to conduct. Her attorney argued those provisions were unenforceable. The mediator disagreed. I am not a vindictive person. I want to say that plainly. I don't take satisfaction in her losses, but I also won't pretend that a certain clarity didn't arrive in the aftermath. The clarity of knowing that I had been fair and careful and honest throughout the worst year of my life, and that the ground I was standing on at the end of it was solid because I had built it right. Illy graduated the following December. He asked me to be there. I was. She was there too, of course. It was her son's graduation. We were civil. We sat on different sides. During the reception afterward, there was a moment where we were both standing near the same food table, and she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "You were a good father to him." I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't. I said, "He's a good man. He did most of it himself." And I moved to the other side of the room. Frank still calls me on my birthday. Last year he drove up from Charlotte and we had lunch. He asked how I was doing, and I told him honestly that I was doing well, which surprised me a little when I said it because it was true. He laughed and said he was glad. He said he still thought about the conversation at the diner. He said he admired how I'd handled everything. I told him I'd had a good teacher. His daughter had introduced us, after all. He laughed harder at that. There are things I think about now that I didn't let myself think about during the worst of it. I think about what I might have done differently earlier when the distance first started showing. Whether I made so much space that I made space for the wrong things. Whether there were conversations I avoided because I didn't want to disrupt something that still, on the surface, looked whole. I don't know the answers to those questions. I'm not sure they have answers that would help me. What I know is this. I am 51 years old. I live in a smaller house now, on a quieter street, and I have dinner with Eli and his girlfriend every few weeks. I run my consulting business. I call my mother on Sundays. I have learned to eat breakfast without looking at my phone, which sounds trivial, but is actually one of the better things I've managed in recent years. A woman I met at a professional conference in Charlotte asked me to dinner 6 months ago. We've been out a few times now. She's a structural engineer who grew up in Ohio and has opinions about food that I find charming and sometimes alarming. She makes me laugh in the specific way that means she's getting at something true. I don't know where that goes. I'm not in a hurry. I am someone who has learned, at considerable cost, that rushing past the present moment to get to a future you've imagined is how you miss what's actually in front of you. So I am here, right now. That's all. It's enough. I've thought a lot about what actually causes a marriage to fall apart. Not the moment you find the receipt. Not the emails left open on the laptop. Those are just the evidence of something that already happened long before. Some quiet unraveling that both people usually know about, and neither one names out loud. What I did wrong, if I'm being honest, was confuse making space with building connection. I cleared my schedule, rearranged my days, absorbed the extra weight without complaint. And I told myself that was love. Maybe it was. But somewhere in there, I stopped asking hard questions because I didn't want to disturb a surface that still looked, from a certain angle, like a life I'd chosen. That cost me time. I can't get it back. I've made peace with that. What I can say is this. The way you respond to a slow-moving disaster tells you more about who you are than the disaster itself does. When I found that receipt, I had two choices: react from the wound or think from the steadiest part of myself. I chose the second one, not because I'm particularly wise, but because my mother raised me to do the next useful thing. Document. Consult. Be fair. Build ground you can stand on. That's not coldness. That's what it looks like when you respect yourself enough to move carefully. And here's the thing about Eli that I keep coming back to. He wasn't obligated to stand by me. His mother is his mother. He had every reason to stay neutral, to protect himself, to wait and see. Instead, he sat down on my kitchen counter on his second night home and said simply, "Something's going on." You already knew. He'd been watching his mother change for months, and he hadn't said anything because he didn't want to cause me pain. That's not a small thing. That's a person with character. I didn't teach him that by lecturing him. I taught him that by showing up to his soccer games and his homework meltdowns and his college applications and every ordinary moment that didn't seem significant at the time but turned out to be everything. You build the people you love the same way you build anything worth keeping. Slowly, consistently, without expecting immediate results. Frank still drives up from Charlotte once a year. He is a man who could have chosen his daughter over the truth. And he didn't, not because he stopped loving her, but because he understood that real love doesn't protect people from consequences. It just stays present while they face them. I am 51 years old, and I am genuinely okay. Not performing okay. Not building toward okay. Actually there. The structural engineer from Ohio made me laugh last Tuesday over a disagreement about whether cornbread needed sugar in it. It was a completely ridiculous argument, and I loved every second of it. Life has a way of returning to you what you put into it. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. The receipt in the blazer pocket, the emails on the shared laptop, none of that arrived out of nowhere. And neither did Eli calling me dad, or Frank shaking my hand across that diner table, or the fact that I went to sleep that night at the gala with something close to peace. You get back what you put in. That's not a promise anyone makes you. It's just how it works.